Welcome to the Rebekah Panepinto Project. Today, I am very excited to host a dear friend named David Vulcano. David is a well-known thought leader and change agent within the clinical research industry and works through numerous associations, boards, and initiatives. Among other things, he is currently the Vice President of Research Compliance and Integrity for HCA Healthcare's portfolio of companies. He also currently serves as the Honorary President for the Society of Clinical Research Sites. David lives just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, where he involves himself in work, family life, and other charitable and entrepreneurial opportunities. We had an amazing conversation today as we were able to dive into the niche of clinical trials and how they serve the wider healthcare industry. Enjoy the show. David, welcome to the show today.
Hey, thanks, Rebekah. It's great to be here. Good to see you again.
I know, it's so fun. I've so randomly run into you around Nashville. And this time I was like, hey, we got to collaborate. So thanks for being game, and I'm excited to dive in today.
Absolutely. Thrilled.
Yeah, you serve such an interesting part of healthcare that I only became more familiar with when I was working for a group called EMIDS, as they were really want to expand in life sciences and CRO. And I didn't even understand that the niche existed and was part of the ecosystem until it was called out.
Right.
So then I've met you and learned a lot more about it. So as we kind of set the stage here for the conversation, can you walk us through really what that relationship to healthcare that the CROs and clinical trials in general have in the industry today?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I mean, especially like Nashville, as you know, is a town known for healthcare delivery and health technology. But life science is part of the whole healthcare ecosystem too. And yeah, healthcare can adopt the best practices, right? But who finds the best practices and who finds the next practices? And that's where life science comes into play. So, I mean, obviously in the ecosystem, there's health outcomes, health delivery science, and things along those lines that are part of life science that integrates with healthcare. But many people jump right to, the physical products like drugs, medical devices, diagnostics, and things like that. So, you're part about the different roles that people play, and I know that during our conversation and talk about technology, we'll refer to a lot of these roles, but typically the life science has a sponsor. This is a sponsor is kind of the person that initiates the question. Normally this is a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company with a molecule or a biologic or a medical device company with a medical device, right? So they're sponsoring this research, they're funding it, they're initiating the question, and most times they have a product that will be marketed to the general public and the healthcare community should the science, safety, and efficacy prove out. Then, of course, you have the research sites out there. Research sites are the ones that actually roll up their sleeves and conduct these studies. They enroll patients as participants in these particular clinical studies. They run the protocols. Many research sites are embedded in healthcare operations like hospitals, physician practices, academic medical centers, and things along those lines. Many research sites are freestanding. They're pure play research sites. All they do is run studies. They don't deliver general healthcare, but they have all the healthcare training to be able to run some of these studies. And then you mentioned the CROs, which is an acronym for Contract Research Organization. And CROs are kind of in the middle. They're mostly agents of the sponsors, right? So, a large pharmaceutical company may have everything in-house to run these studies. Small pharmaceutical companies may not have everything in-house to run these studies, especially when you talk about large and multinational studies. So they contract with specialty companies that they call CRO service providers that can manage these studies for them, or components of these studies, whether it's selecting the sites, starting up the sites, monitoring the clinical trial sites, all the way up through designing protocols and analyzing data and delivering the result.
Very interesting. What is that typical timeline from a sponsor saying, hey, I want to bring XYZ to the market, to it actually being able to hit shelves and serve patients, typically walking through this system?
Well, like if you talk about pharmaceutical companies, which are some of the longest. I mean, if you take the time when they actually discover the target and the molecule to meet that target, I mean, it could take 12, 15 years or longer to go from the time that they have identified that molecule for that target to the time that it gets full marketing approval by the FDA. I mean, some countries are faster, some countries are slower, but in the US, it could take 10 to 15 years in many of these cases to do all the preclinical testing, which computer simulations, animal testing, human trials. You start off early on just looking at safety. That may take you a few years to do that. Then you look at short-term efficacy and then long-term efficacy of safety before you can meet that marketing approval. If a drug's already on the market and they're looking for a new indication for the drug, I mean, many drugs started off with one indication and they found benefit in other indications. They don't have to redo a lot of that testing. It could take shorter before they get the marketing label for that particular drug. But a lot of the technology that we'll be talking about and everybody is talking about is working to and showing some evidence and accelerating that, having artificial intelligence find better molecules matching this. The FDA has put a lot of pressure on decreasing the need for the preclinical testing and animal testing that is necessary because we can have some of this AI do better predictive modeling in this that can eliminate some of the earlier testing, as well as better outcome predicting for the studies for safety and efficacy. So we're very excited to see what AI is going to bring. We're seeing some early success. Not everything is successful, but bringing that timeline from the discovery of the molecule to the bedside of the patients, will hopefully decrease to get sooner and then get it out there cheaper as well for participants and for patients and healthcare providers.
So I obviously look at this from a consumer perspective, but I think of like, not to be political, but the COVID vaccine or Ozempic and GLP-1s. It feels like they just showed up overnight and there's still a question of like, are these safe? Are they not? But
Right.
obviously they had to go through some kind of process like this. So were they years in the making too? We just found out about it late in the game?
Without question, right? You're not going to see all the commercials for Ozempic and Mounjaro and all that kind of stuff because, the pharmaceutical companies are allowed to advertise for these drugs until they get that approval. But, these types of drugs are, were in the making for, a decade or more before they were able to get out to market. So yes, it's all kind of the surprise about, we've seen the magazine covers where, well, this is a miracle drug, as if God himself just placed this on the planet without a whole lot of recognition about the years of clinical trials and the hundreds, if not thousands, of patients who have volunteered their bodies to be among the first to take these drugs or medical devices or biologics so that we can study how it works in the humans, what's working, what's not working, amend the molecules, amend the treatment protocols, and things along those lines. I mean, the COVID vaccines were an anomaly because it was very rushed. The mRNA technology that backed them was not new. Putting them use in COVID was new because COVID didn't exist until 2019, right? So getting the indication of that was very new. And there was some different approval mechanisms for COVID with emergency use than the normal FDA approval mechanism. So yeah, it's not surprising to, for the general population who does not have discussions about clinical trials and research in their patient advocacy groups or with their healthcare providers to just say that this just appeared when arguably there's decade or more of research to make that appear.
Interesting.
You know,
Is
you, you
there
know, you know Nashville, right? You know the music
yeah.
industry, right? How many
Mhm.
people were an overnight success? Yes, it took me
Yeah.
10 years to become an overnight success.
10-year
Right?
town for
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
same bill, same principles apply.
Yeah. So is there a life of a drug continuous testing process though too? Because when it comes to like the GLP-1s and Ozempic, there's a lot of unknowns of like the effects after 10 years of use and muscle loss and la da 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 da. Do these clinical trials continue for the life of the drug and like they're going back 10 years later to see these people who were in those trials to see the effects? Or what does that look like ultimately in just the long
Yeah, it
term?
certainly can. I mean, it's going to be all risk based in these scenarios, and then FDA can certainly open that back up, or a pharmaceutical company that sponsors the molecule may open that back up if they're seeing safety concerns. I mean, pharmaceutical companies, they get lauded of profits and things like that, but I deal with them every day, right? Yes, that is, the nature of the beast. That's the economics, right? You have to have cash flow to sustain, to develop these new products and keep them on the market. but I've never talked to a pharmaceutical company that has said, we don't care about safety or things like that. I mean, in the R&D world, they're all about safety, whether it's short term, long term. They want to know everything. I mean, in clinical trials, we report every adverse event, whether it was related or not to the drug on some of those, in those trials. I mean, if you were struck by lightning, if you were hit by a meteor, we're going to report it as an adverse event in the clinical trial. If case,
Oh, interesting.
if 20 people in a trial were struck by lightning, maybe there's something there, right? So we report pretty much anything that can happen in the clinical trial to make sure that it's in the clinical trial data for regulatory approval. Some studies will be designed for longer term. Some of them will term shortly, but the FDA may have what they call post-marketing surveillance, or sometimes they call them phase 4 studies, whereas they're looking at longer term effects. FDA has safety reporting mechanisms too. You probably heard a lot about how they streamlined those. They had like one for medical devices, one for this, and they said, we're having one portal for adverse events on any medical products. And, if they start to get signals out there, they may work with the manufacturer of that product and say, hey, we need to do a post-marketing surveillance study for this. And then they also, looked at different indications. Medicine is individualized, right? So, a lot of the new things, and I know diversity has taken on a bad connotation in certain areas, but in medicine, when we talk about diversity, we're talking about good science, right? That's, a person, females have different biological systems than males, right? Their performance in the workplace, political discussions, right? But you can't dispute that females have different biologies than males, right? Different race and ethnicities have different backgrounds. So when we're looking at safety and efficacy for the general population, some of the diversity and the representativeness of that data that represents the disease population is critical. So a lot of the newer things is making sure that the data that's generated in these clinical trials is not just, only balding white males, right? It's representative of the population for it. And FDA has the right to say, hey, all your clinical trials was balding white males. We need to do some post-marketing surveillance, say, on female population or, pregnant females or the Latino population or what have you, to make sure that safety and efficacy is truly representative of the disease prevalence.
Well, we see a shortage though when you think of like organ donors, right? So, how do you find enough people and diversity for clinical trials of people willing to be like, hey, I'll let my body be a science project when there's some fear tied to it, or maybe just not even enough people with the disease that needs to be tested? How do you go find these groups and make sure it's a
Okay.
really successful trial?
So you have two very divergent questions there. One is representativeness, and one is rare disease. Okay, so
Yeah.
rare disease is always a challenge. One infrastructure that the clinical trial sponsors are generally tied to is the geography of a site. I have a site here in Nashville, Tennessee, or I have a site in Denver, or a site in Austin, right? And we set up that site to run the study, and then we expect everybody to come to that site. So if you have Duchenne's disease, if you want to be in a trial, you got to come to Nashville. Well, that may be fine, but trials may last years, and people have lives, they have jobs, they have schools. The cost of that is difficult. So the past 10 or 12 years, there's been a lot of movement to try to, first of all, decentralize is the word that people use, the trial site, and to say what can be done locally in their communities, especially for these rare diseases, right? Not all of those rare diseases sitting here in Nashville or it's sitting in Denver, right? It's all over the country or the world. So what can be done in their communities by local healthcare providers? What can be done at home through the use of wearable technologies or other patient observation technologies that is good enough for the science to really show the safety and efficacy with the same rigor as we would if they were physically in the location and being evaluated by the research site. So that's one mechanism. Um, the other mechanism is challenging the regulators as well as the industry of new models of doing research sites. So, rather than having, if I know that there are 20,000 people around the country with a particular rare disease, or 10,000 people with a rare disease, or less, fewer in many cases, we may say that, rather than, if I have 30 sites in my network, rather than say, well, we'll take Denver, Austin, and Nashville as a site, and we have set them up individually. Why can't we set up the network as a site and leverage technology, leverage remote observations, leverage telehealth and things like that, and say we have one site. So I can't tell you where the participant's going to come from, but we've set ourselves up as one site with multiple locations as opposed to multiple sites. So it's challenging. There's a lot of myth. There's a lot of friction and a lot of homeostasis that kind of keeps us back to the norm. But these are the challenges that a lot of these new site networks are coming forth and saying that we can do this a lot better and faster. So diversity and representativeness is key, right? Because we already have health disparities and macroeconomic issues that contribute to this. So it's not just about convincing people and building trust in volunteering for a clinical trial of, being among the first, 20 or 100 or 200 people to take a particular drug. So you have that inherent trust anyway, coupled with the larger, that's the hair at the end of the tail at the end of the dog, right? The larger dog is macroeconomic issues and health disparity issues. So, getting people to the trial sites or bringing trial sites to them, whether it's a mobile bus type, that comes into their mobile trial sites, are a lot of new strategies coming out, as well as a lot of the technologies that are being used to be able to bring the clinical trials to the participants, as opposed to having to bring the participants to the trial. I equate it from as the old Wayne Gretzky quote, right? You have to skate, the success isn't skating to where the puck is, it's skating to where the puck's going to be, right? Same concept. We need to bring the trials to where the participants are going to be, not keep beating the drum about having them come to the locations where it's safe and appropriate, of course.
Yeah. I would assume you run into the same bottleneck in traditional healthcare too, of just lack of interoperability and all these different systems and all these different sites probably don't want to talk to each other. There's HIPAA, there's all that. So how are you guys helping to solve for that? Because that could accelerate this ease of making sure you get the right data from the right people too.
Yeah. So, there's how healthcare is solving it, and then there's how we're doing it within the clinical trials industry for this. I mean, healthcare, when they passed the legislation under President Obama that created the incentives for electronic health records, right? I mean, I think it was President Bush that said we should all have electronic health records by the year 2012. And nobody did anything. And then the Obama administration came in and says probably the only thing they agreed with the Bush administration, right? Of, yeah, we should have all had electronic health records by 2012, but we're gonna give incentives to people to adopt them. So we did. But when you read that legislation, one of the key things in that was not only just interoperability so that a patient can and their providers can have the full totality of the information needed for the care, and decrease a lot of this friction about, well, I got a C2 scan, but I got to go get it and bring it over here. Or I already answered the question about allergies here. Why do I have to answer it here? Kind of stuff. But in the clinical trial arena, it's add some extra layers of complexity on that. So even though healthcare is moving towards that, and part of the reason to moving to electronic records was to gain those efficiencies in interoperability, which we're still struggling with, but new federal infrastructures that they call TEFCA and qualified health information networks are right at the dawn of solving a lot of those interoperability and exchange problems. In clinical trials, it's interesting because a lot of the data that we gather in clinical trials is above and beyond the data that we gather in routine care, right? Because it's more focused on the safety of these products, more target on the efficacy of products. The integrity of that information is, very important because, not to discount the lack of integrity for the information of taking care of one patient, but the data that we're generating in a clinical trial could affect the care of millions of patients. And, whether or not a product is approved by the FDA, a product could not be approved only because the data was bad and it could have saved millions of people, or the opposite. It could hurt millions of people because the data was bad. So we're extremely hawkish on the data and the systems that generate that data, on the integrity of the IT systems that generate that data. Um, but then we also gather a lot of other data that's not generally gathered in routine care, as I mentioned. And to do that, you need to have all these bolt on systems in clinical trials to operate the trials and gather the data that's necessary, custom to that specific trial. And that's where in the past 10, 12 years, I've shifted a lot more to technology and digital type gathering and paperless type gathering, as opposed to, when I started back in the Stone Ages when everything was, basically on paper.
The Stone Ages. I don't buy that one, but it might
I'm
have been a
getting
long time
old.
ago.
It's getting time to turn this over to the younger generation, right?
We're coming, slowly but surely. Uh, I'm interested too, hot topic of the day and, even month and year, AI. Where is AI being able to help efficiencies all along this system and process in the day-to-day of bringing, a new product to market?
So AI, obviously, when you look at it from the macro level, is, in the Gartner hype cycle, we're definitely past the peak of inflated expectations and approaching or in that trough of disillusionment before we get into the plateau of productivity, right? So we've all heard the excitement and the hype. We're playing with this. We're finding the faults, the shortcomings, and things like that as we start to implement these, right? I mean, you're familiar, I'm sure. What was it, the MIT study and Harvard study and all these business studies that say, 85, 90, 95% of the AI initiatives fail to show the outcomes that they desire, right? But that's fine because that means we learn from those mistakes, and then the 15% that do great things, right? But it is our newest team member, right? And I always equate it to Bruce Tuckman's 4 stages of team development: forming, storming, norming, performing. We are definitely forming and storming with AI right now. We have kind of one foot on the boat and one foot on the dock, so to speak, of, where does this fit in? Where is it right? How do we create balance with this as we transition from normal methods to AI enhanced operabilities? But the AI is all over the whole life cycle of research, whether it's, discovery of the treatment, whether it is enhancing the clinical research process, and well as helping with publications within these clinical research. And, these large language models being able to assimilate large amounts of data or large amounts of text to, help people make individual decisions as well as macro decisions. So we are struggling with AI to figure out what the right use cases are. But nevertheless, we're seeing very small successes that can move into large successes. A lot of AI is around recruitment of participants in trials, like you mentioned earlier. So how can we get better representation of participants in the clinical trials that, so that the data adequately represents the disease prevalence? How do we use all the data that's out there while respecting people's privacy, all the things that we're supposed to do? But how do we get that balance of that respecting people's privacy and, say, a rare disease where there's maybe only a few hundred or a few thousand cases across the country, to let these individuals know or help develop products for them, and then help them be able to come in and test those products. So, or finding participants as trials is, one of the more published use cases in the use of AI in clinical research.
So you said a really cool point within healthcare. One, because you've been at HCA for a long time, but because you get to see a clinical trial from beginning to end and even like have say in the supply chain. I'm curious, throughout your career, have you seen something come from ideation with a sponsor to reality to changing patients' lives that really has lit the passion for you to continue to serve and do what you do every day?
Yeah, we've seen a number of those things. I mean, we get involved. I'm with clinical trial sites, so we generally get involved when it starts testing in real world scenarios, right? So we don't get involved from the very beginning of these, but there's been a number of molecules and medical devices that we've seen from the beginning of the human testing, or maybe just a little bit before, as we prepare or help these companies prepare for human testing that have come to market. So there's a number of those. But I'll tell you, Rebecca, that for me personally, what jazzes me more is not so much because I'm an operator, right? I'm not a scientist. I'm an operator. So what jazzes me more is not so much finding the cures or finding the better treatments. What jazzes me more is finding the new ways to finding answers. So it's not necessarily the answers, it's finding new ways to find the answers. How can we do this better? How can we do this faster? How can we do this cheaper? Those are the things, and finding the new ways to find the answers is generally my challenge in doing this. And we kind of let the scientists and the clinicians work it out to find the answers.
Hmm, very cool. Huge enabler, though. I mean, without you, things potentially could never hit the shelves if they didn't go through the
Well,
right process.
Well, the clinical trials folks, the staff behind the clinical trials, the research coordinators, the investigators, we're part of the supply chain. If you don't have, chemicals to make the products, you don't have it, right? But when people think of supply chain, oftentimes, and I've faulted this too, right? During COVID, I'm, a member of board of directors. I'm certified, private company director through Private Directors Association. And during COVID, it really woke me up on the dependencies people have on our supply chains, right? If you don't have your supply chain, you can't run your business. And so many people take supply chains for granted. And I immediately flipped to, holy cow, the clinical trial sites and the way that we operate are part of the supply chain of getting new products to market or new information that can help providers, help participants at the bedside. The AI example, one person, we get a lot of talk in healthcare about, is AI going to take my job kind of thing. And we hear this in life science too. And I tell people, I says, let me tell you something, my music industry colleague told me about this, right? And this would probably never come up in healthcare, or maybe it would have, but a music industry colleague says, yeah, when Thomas Edison created the phonograph, right? All these live musicians said, well, that's it. No one's going to come to live concerts anymore. They're just going to listen to it on the phonograph, right? Did they stop going to live concerts? No. And then people say, oh, the cassette deck, you just going to hit record off the radio. Nobody's going to buy music anymore. Did people stop buying music? No. The keyboard came out. Oh, we don't need trumpet players or violin players or drummers anymore because we have synthesizers that do all that. We still have drummers and trumpet players and violins, right? So, did their industry shift with all these things? With Napster, with streaming? Yeah, their industry did shift. Their jobs may look differently, or how they commercialize or sustain themselves looks differently. But where you add value as a professional, it can't take that away. Years ago, if you were a phone operator and you were doing this, right? We've seen those commercials. Yeah, technology took your job. But like a musician, professionals, you add value. And if anything, it could take some of the more road tasks off of your desk to let you practice at the top of your profession, as opposed to spending 60, 70, 80% of your day doing things that are not at the top of your profession, but things that technology can do for you. So technology is probably not going to take away your job as a professional where you add value, but the professional using technology and AI likely will be the next person to take your job. So we encourage all our professionals to make sure you have, solid understanding of responsible oversight of this technology. Start looking at it and see where it can enhance your workflows and your productivity.
It can be so funny to me how old can become new again, and even the luxury too. Like, I have my Spotify subscription, but almost every person who's released a new album that I like in the last 3 months also had a record come out with it,
A
and you can buy
vinyl,
a record.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like that's the luxury experience now, and that's the giveaway. And they're going to sign the record, not obviously anything digital. And so that now has become a higher value, almost like a luxury good, and old has become new again. It's comical how
It's
the
crazy, right?
cycles.
Yeah, I was in the airport the other day, and they had the Parnassus bookstore, and it had a little section for vinyl. It's like, when was the last time you saw a section that you can flip through vinyl, right? So yeah, vinyls and that come back.
Yeah, it's a collector's item now.
Mhm.
Mhm. Well, David, this has been fun, but I do have one final question,
Okay.
and I want to hear from you. What is the guiding principle that you've lived by to be successful in business?
So I would think that maybe not overall, but let me tell you one thing that at least drives me in the primary career for in life science, it's kind of my mantra that wake up every day and I sit here and think, how can I go out and make our data a little better, our patients and our participants a little better off, and our work days a little easier. And if I can contribute to that in any way, shape, or form, whether it's a day job, professional tithing, professional societies, things along those lines. But those are the things that drive me. It helps narrow down where I want to focus my time on and resources on. But yes, waking up and going, how can I make our data a little better, our patients and our participants a little better off, and our work days a little easier is certainly key, for me. I spend a lot of time in regulatory affairs, right? And I will say that, I'll look back at an interesting defining moment in my life, right? Because a lot of my stuff is confinedly in it. And in seventh grade, I was playing a nerd game. I went to nerd school. I was a math, not an athlete. And it was the first year, and it was a game called onset theory, right? And I was in a novice tournament. Okay. So pretty good at the game, very good mathlete. Novice tournament. I'm in the championship round. I'm playing against another guy, and he knew a rule that I didn't know because I would never taught that rule, right? My school, they didn't teach us this rule. They didn't use this rule. We didn't play with this rule. He knew a rule that I didn't know. And call the moderator over, and the moderator says, "Nope, I know, well, that's the rule," and he's, "That's fine." And I couldn't assimilate that rule in my gameplay, and I won second place in the Fox tournament. Now, my second place trophy was this big. His trophy was this big, right? In the regular season, I beat this kid time and time again. But I learned that time that in a highly regulated society or industry where clinical trials and clinical research is, you have to know the rules and you have to know how to use those rules to your advantage and have to know how to win within those rules. And that's been a key critical, at least I believe in my success, is having a vast knowledge of all the rules, regulations, ethics, and things like that out there and finding your way to drive success within that parameter.
Amazing. Well, David, always a pleasure. This was awesome and great to learn more about this area that so often I feel like can be forgotten about or just missed, or again, like Ozempic just shows up on the scene and you don't think of all the behind the scenes. So thanks for
Right.
sharing that with us and your passion for the industry.
Well, Rebecca, it's fantastic to see you again. I'm sure I'll see you around Nashville, if not in other places. But thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the dialogue. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. We'll talk again soon.